H.R. 8438 is the bill that was dingleberried into law, buried in the middle of the 5,593-page Coronabus. And regime change is all over this law. It's clearly articulated in the section that outlines our new policy, which says that we will, quote, continue rejecting the invalid results of the fraudulent August 9th, 2020 presidential election in Belarus, unquote. It also says that we will, quote, refuse to recognize Alexander Lukashenko as the legitimately elected leader of Belarus, unquote. And it is now our policy to, quote, continue supporting calls for new presidential and parliamentary elections, unquote. Lukashenko out. That's the goal, and it is clear. But the kicker for me, the thing that made me decide that this episode had to be produced right now, is the authorization of funding. Because the Dingleberry Law authorizes, quote, such sums as may be necessary, unquote, for fiscal years 2021 and 2022. Put another way, that's unlimited funding.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 229th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. And this episode, this is what I do this podcast for. Because I started Congressional Dish, I don't even know how many years ago. It's been a lot. 9-ish? I don't know. I started in 2012. But I started doing this podcast because I was doing something weird. I was watching C-SPAN and reading the congressional record in my free time. And I know, who does that? I'm a freak. But in my weird hobby, I was seeing and reading things going on in Congress that I found to be so important, but yet no one seemed to know about them. And having this knowledge and having no one to tell was making me insane. You know, my poor husband had to deal with me ranting and raving in the living room like a lunatic about these things. And so before he divorced me, I started this podcast. And he hasn't actually divorced me. I just think that he would have had I continued with that behavior. But right now, here I am in 2021, and I'm having that same experience all over again. I am seeing important information in black and white, in newly signed laws, not bills, laws that leave no doubt whatsoever that it is now the official policy of the United States to seek regime change in Belarus. And yet I haven't really seen anything about this. I'm not seeing anyone talking about it on TV. I'm not seeing it being discussed on Twitter. I haven't even heard about it in any podcasts. And so if I didn't have a podcast, if I couldn't share this information with you, I would be ranting and raving like a psycho and inevitably locked up in a rubber room. So thank you for listening to Congressional Dish. You are saving my life and my marriage. But this is because I think that regime changing another country is a pretty big deal. And so I'm going to tell you what I know about it today. But basically, there was a quickly written bill that passed only the House of Representatives at the end of 2020 that hitched a ride into law attached to the Coronabus. And the Coronabus is the law, well, for most people, it was the law branded as COVID relief. So at the end of last year, there was all this talk about the COVID relief bill, the COVID relief bill. But in reality, it was a government funding bill with COVID relief and a whole bunch of other attached. You know, the government funding law just brought a bunch of legislative dingleberries into law along with it. COVID was one of them, and this Belarus thing was another. You know, basically, your Congress did a year's worth of work in one massive bill. It was 5,593 pages, and it's an excellent opportunity to hide all kinds of shit. And like I said, one of those dingleberries made changing the government of Belarus our official foreign policy, and it funds the first steps of that regime change. Now, the name of the dingleberry bill is not in the table of contents. In fact, the word Belarus isn't anywhere in the table of contents. And so if you're buzzword scanning and not looking at each of the 5,593 pages in the Coronabus, Belarus won't pop up on your radar until you're 2,573 pages deep, until you're about 5 girthy Moby Dicks into this new law. And it is clear, like freshly Windexed glass, no ambiguity at all, that a regime change operation in Belarus has begun. How do I know? Well, for starters, here are some key phrases from the policy outline made law by the Coronabus. We now, quote, refuse to recognize, unquote, the president of Belarus as the president. And we now recognize a brand new institution based in Lithuania that will participate in a, quote, peaceful transition of power, unquote. And just to be sure that I wasn't reading this wrong, I've eavesdropped on some conversations between global warmongers, and they are strategizing this regime change out loud.
The pro-democracy movement in Belarus now faces the difficult prospect of dislodging Mr. Lukashenko, the unrecognized president who refuses to leave office.
Coordinating strategies with transatlantic allies should be a priority and include calls for dialogue, immediate release of political prisoners, and support for the political opposition's demands for holding new elections under international supervision and beginning negotiations on a post-Lukashenko transition.
The people of Belarus have protested for months, demanding that Lukashenko resign. They are the true source of legitimacy. Tsikhanouskaya and the Coordination Council for the Transition of Power, which she leads from Vilnius, Lithuania, is recognized by the European Union and many others as the true voice of the Belarusian people.
This bill today updates the Belarus Democracy Acts of 2004, 2006, and 2011 that I authored, and renews the personal, economic, and visa sanctions on an expanded list of bad actors in the Belarusian government, and, this is new, Russian individuals complicit in the crackdown.
The aim of the sanctions is to put sufficient pressure on Belarus so that Lukashenko has to go. This is really a regime change group of sanctions.
It calls for new elections. It recognizes the Coordination Council as a legitimate institution to participate in a dialogue on a peaceful transition of power.
Any questions? Now, obviously, I have all the details for you, including who the hell all those people were. And so let's get started with our Belarus deep dive. And I think the first question that we need to answer is, where the fuck is Belarus? And don't feel dumb. I aced geography in high school, and I didn't know. And it turns out that Belarus is Russia's next door neighbor on the Europe side. And so to picture where exactly Belarus is, like picture Russia, which shares a massive landmass, which is Russia, Asia, Europe. But Russia is a big ass country. And Russia is like a giant wall that stretches across the entire eastern part of the landmass. Well, the next door neighbor, halfway up that wall on the Europe side, that's where Belarus is. And Belarus's neighbor to the south is Ukraine, which is a country that we switcherooed the government of during the Obama-Biden years. And then to the north of Belarus are the Baltic countries, which include Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And all three of those countries are countries that I feel like my very good and expensive American education taught me damn near nothing about. But I do know for sure that we've been amassing troops there since 2014, the same year as the Ukraine regime change, which, by the way, was orchestrated by then Vice President Joe Biden, who is now our commander-in-chief. And if what I just said is news to you, the Obama-Biden administration orchestrated a coup in Ukraine in 2014. They did this after Ukraine's president dared to enter into an economic partnership with Russia instead of signing a trade agreement with the European Union, a trade agreement which would have absorbed Ukraine into the World Trade System, or at least that's my nickname for it. But the World Trade System is a intended to be global system of laws that our country has been dedicated to expanding since the end of World War II. The main organizations that make up this system are the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and their loan shark, the International Monetary Fund. The reality of U.S. history since World War II is that we don't give a damn if a government is democratically elected as long as they're willing to economically partner with the World Trade System. We stand for democracy in words, but the World Trade System in our actions. And to really understand our actions towards Ukraine or Belarus or a lot of countries, we really have to understand our relationship with Russia. Because Russia, as a part of the Soviet Union, was our partner in World War II. But after that war ended, when the World Trade System was going global and became our foreign policy goal, the Soviet Union, which ran its economy a different way, using economic laws branded as communism, Well, anyone that used anything kind of like communism to run their economy, those countries became our enemy. Communism was the boogeyman. But when it comes to the Soviet Union, that was a boogeyman with real and numerous nuclear weapons, which, by the way, Russia still has. But the Cold War, that's what that was all about. It was a battle of economic systems. And in the early 1990s, after communism lost and the Soviet Union was disbanded, which made the world trade system the dominant economic system in the world, well, we spent the 1990s trying to get Russia to integrate into and obey the economic laws of the World Trade System. Here's Senator Patrick Leahy speaking in a hearing in the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Foreign Operations about Russia and its neighbors in 1994, a committee that 26 years later, he's still on.
There is no greater United States national security objective today than to assist Russia make a peaceful transition to a stable democratic form of government, an open, pluralistic society, a market economy. Such a transition offers the best prospect of a long-term, cooperative, peaceful relationship with the only other nuclear power capable of destroying the United States.
Put another way, by then Russian studies professor at Princeton, Stephen Cohen, at the same hearing,
the guiding principle of that policy since 1991 has been, and evidently based on the hearing today remains, an exceedingly missionary and highly interventionist idea that the United States can and should intervene in Russia's internal affairs in order to convert or transform that nation into an American-style system at home and a submissive junior partner of the United States abroad.
And that is a bipartisan policy.
Now, to be fair, this unwise American policy toward Russia began under President Bush in the end of 1991 with the breakup of the Soviet Union. But for a full year now, President Clinton has expanded that policy, made it worse, and therefore now it is his policy.
And we all know that the Clinton people are the Obama people who are now the Biden people. The same clique is back in charge of our government. And here's what they wanted during that window of time in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union broke up, and when Russia wasn't at the top of our enemy list. Here's then Deputy Secretary of State and current Council on Foreign Relations member, Strobe Talbot.
Our approach from the beginning, our strategy, has been to reinforce those trends in Russian political and economic life that together we believe constitute the essence of the great transformation underway in that country. Those trends are democratization and privatization. They are, in fact, interlocking. They are mutually reinforcing. The more people work in private enterprise, the more they are likely to participate in the democratic process and the more they are likely to vote for candidates who will support economic as well as political freedom.
And so what exactly did the servants to the private sector, the World Trade guys, want to privatize? What did they want the multinational stock market beholding companies to be able to buy and control? What are the privatization prizes in Russia?
The world has capital flows, potential for investment that can move into societies like Russia, where the population is highly educated. It's a tremendous human resource, where there are natural resources that can be exploited for the good of Russia and for the entire world economy.
And so in 1994, when that hearing took place, and when the world traders were crystal clear about what they wanted from Russia, the president, the first president of post-Soviet Union Russia, was a man named Boris Yeltsin, who, let's just take a quick second to remember what kind of democracy the Clinton administration supported in New Russia under Yeltsin. Because on August 19th, 1991, when the Soviet Union was still in charge of Russia and a bunch of its neighbors, a group of old-school Soviet Union communist guys in a last grasp for power drove tanks up to the Russian version of their Congress and threatened to attack it. And this was like a real armed insurrection against their Congress, not a bunch of bumpkins with flags. Well, as the tanks were rolling towards their Capitol building, Boris Yeltsin, in a super ballsy move, stood on one of the tanks and publicly declared that what was happening was a, quote, cynical right-wing coup attempt, unquote. And eventually the tanks backed off, and Boris Yeltsin became democracy's hero. 4 months after that almost coup, Yeltsin formed an alliance with two other Soviet republics, which was a move that dissolved the Soviet Union. And with the Soviet Union overlord gone, Yeltsin got to really run Russia as its president. Yeltsin became the top dog. To organize the new Russia, Yeltsin told Russia's parliament, their Congress, that if they gave Yeltsin 1 year of emergency powers and let him create new laws by himself without having to bring them to Congress for a vote, he would solve their economic crisis and give them back a thriving, healthy system. And Russia's parliament actually bought that nonsense. After all, Yeltsin was democracy's hero. And so they said yes. Whoopsie. And so with his new emergency law writing powers secured, Boris Yeltsin then immediately summoned a team of World Trade System economists who quickly wrote Russia a privatization plan. A few days before Halloween that year, Yeltsin announced his plan, which included lifting price controls, which allows the market rate, otherwise known as how much a company can get away with charging, to determine the basic costs of living, and it announced the first phase of the rapid-fire sell-off of the country's approximately 225,000 government-owned companies. And a lot of people, about a third of Russia, went straight broke that year, which was not unexpected. Here's then Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot in 1994.
Privatization involves closing down inefficient state enterprises, while the shift to market economics, at least initially, brings higher prices. The result is social pain, disruption, and fear of the future. If they reach critical mass, those ingredients can explode into a political backlash against reform.
And so after a year and a half of those reforms driving Russians into poverty in droves, in March of 1993, the Russian version of Congress told Yeltsin that he was done, and they took back his dictatorial powers. But then Yeltsin went on television and declared a state of emergency, which restored his powers. Russia's independent constitutional court then ruled 9-3 that Yeltsin's power grab violated the Constitution on 8 different counts. But then Yeltsin, Mr. Democracy, issued a decree announcing that the Constitution was abolished and that Parliament, their Congress, would be dissolved. 2 days later, that Parliament that Yeltsin tried to dissolve voted 636-2 to impeach Yeltsin for his clearly dictatorial act. And this was a really telling moment, because if we're trying to make the world a democratically operated place, if democracy were our true goal, then what Yeltsin did was a clear no-no, and the appropriate action would be to support the Russian version of Congress and their courts. But the World Trade System, the Clinton administration very much included, supported Yeltsin instead, who was enacting the economic reforms that they wanted, and their new democracy could be damned. And Clinton wasn't going rogue here. Congress voted to give Yeltsin $2.5 billion of our tax money to support his power grab. And so what did he do with our support and tax money? Well, his next move was to dissolve all city and regional governments in the country. And then on October 4th, 1993, Yeltsin ordered the army to storm the Russian White House and set it on fire. The day after that, Yeltsin dissolved the Russian Congress and started enacting new economic laws. That's how we supported Russia's democracy. The Senate appropriations hearing you're listening to clips from was 3 months after that, and here's then Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot.
President Yeltsin needs to have the confidence that if he continues to press forward on a strong economic reform program, Western support will be swift and substantial. But he and his colleagues in both the executive and the legislative branches of the Russian government must also understand something else. And that is the cause and effect relationship between internal reform and outside support. Our support will follow their reform. It cannot be the other way around.
And so the fire sale, the reforms began.
Now, we do not know what the future holds. We do not know what kind of a Russia we will be sharing the planet with early in the 21st century. We do not know if it will have stayed on a reform path and have continued to move in the direction of integration.
Well, we know now, and we know that things didn't turn out exactly how the World Trade System wanted. Boris Yeltsin and his team did sell off the Russian commons in a privatization fire sale, but he didn't allow foreign multinationals to buy up Russia's assets directly in the auctions that sold off Russia's companies. Instead, Yeltsin allowed Russian oligarchs, so Russians' rich and well-connected families, to rig the sales so they could buy up all the good stuff for themselves. How they did this is that Yeltsin's government transferred shitloads of Russian tax money, which should have gone into the national bank or treasury, into private banks set up by the oligarchs. Yeltsin's government then hired those same now private banks to run the auctions for the oil fields, their mines, all the valuable stuff. Then the oligarch-owned banks bid in the auctions that they were running, and they made themselves the owners of the Russian government treasures. Only after that did they open up the newly privatized companies owned by the oligarchs to foreign multinationals to be partners in the privatization, but they couldn't own stuff straight up. And so the multinationals that the World Trade System is designed to operate for were kept a step away from true ownership when Yeltsin's government started selling off the commons at insanely low prices. And after that is when our relationship with Russia really started going to shit. After it became clear that Russia wasn't going to let the World Trade System companies pillage its resources after all. Then in 1999, the oligarchs arranged for a quiet handover of power from Boris Yeltsin to Vladimir Putin. No election necessary. And Putin essentially pardoned Yeltsin for everything he did on his way out the door. And so Russia, whose democracy was quickly destroyed with our blessing, now has an economic system governed outside the World Trade System by Russian oligarchs, the rich people in Russia, who have enormous control over that country because their democracy was snuffed out right at the beginning in obscenely anti-democratic actions that our country supported and paid for. The oligarchs then installed Vladimir Putin as president, and Putin, the big bad wolf, remains the Russian boogeyman today. But the main beef that we have with Russia and China, our two main adversaries, is that they are resistant to integrating their economies into the World Trade System. They are doing it a different way. At least that's the beef of the cabal of elites that think that they have a right to rule the world. Because I know that most Americans don't care what kind of economies other countries have, especially countries like Belarus, which the vast majority of us can't find on a map. Which brings me to Ukraine, Belarus's neighbor to the south. In late 2013, when Joe Biden was vice president, Ukraine, at the last minute, pulled out of an economic integration agreement with the World Trade System, specifically with the European Union. Instead of signing that trade agreement, the Ukrainian president partnered economically with Russia, and a regime change operation was put in motion by our State Department. The regime change was planned, at least in part, by Victoria Nuland, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor to then Vice President Dick Cheney during the overthrow Iraq years, and who was then Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs during the Obama-Biden years, when she decided that Arseny Yatsenyuk, Yats, would take over the Ukraine government, along with then Ambassador to Ukraine Jeffrey Pyatt, weeks before the coup. How do we know this? Well, a phone call of them doing so was released on the internet.
I don't think cleats should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea. I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience.
I think we've got to do something to make it stick together, because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it. I think we want to try to get somebody with an international personality to come out here and help to midwife this thing.
Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. So okay. Biden's willing.
Now, the guy you heard on that phone call was Jeffrey Pyatt. At the time, he was our ambassador to Ukraine. Right now, he's our ambassador to Greece. And as for the lady, Victoria Nuland, well, President Biden just nominated her to be his Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, which means that she will be soon ranked third at Biden's State Department. A nice promotion for her. The day after that phone call was leaked, the press secretary for the Defense Department, Jen Psaki, confirmed to a reporter that that call was what we thought it was. And you might recognize Jen Psaki's voice because she's been promoted to Biden's main press secretary now.
Can you say whether if this call is an authentic recording of an authentic conversation between Assistant Secretary Nuland and Ambassador Pyatt?
I didn't say it was inauthentic. I think we can leave it at that.
So you're allowing the fact that it is authentic.
Yes.
And a reporter clapped right back on her spin on what we heard on that call.
It's up to the people of Ukraine, including officials from both sides, to determine the path forward. But it shouldn't be a surprise that there are discussions about events on the ground.
This was more than discussions, though. This was two top U.S. officials that are on the ground discussing a plan that they have to broker a future government and bringing officials from the UN to kind of seal the deal. This is more than the U.S. trying to make suggestions. This is the U.S. midwifing the process.
That was a sake bomb that blew up right in her face. But the Ukraine coup went forward, despite us knowing beforehand that it was going down, and it was successful. And again, the Ukraine regime change operation was one that our new president, Joe Biden, was in charge of back then. He told us this himself during a meeting of World Trade System devoted elites at the Council on Foreign Relations in 2018.
I was, but it just happened to be that was the assignment I got. I got all the good ones, so I got Ukraine.
And then he goes on to brag about how the Ukrainian government that he helped to install fired a prosecutor on his orders. For years, that meeting was an obscure nothing burger buried deep in the asshole of the C-SPAN archives and aired only on fake news indie bullshit media like Congressional Dish. But then President Trump got impeached for threatening to cut off the regime change maintenance money, and that clip of Biden bragging about getting the prosecutor fired became internationally well known. But that whole Trump impeachment, the first one, was about military aid to Ukraine's government, regime change maintenance funds that we have been funneling to the Ukrainian government to keep them World Trade affiliated instead of partnering with Russia again, ever since that coup. We've been paying for weapons and military training, which is being used against Ukrainians and Russians on the Russian side of Ukraine, who have been fighting in a civil war that was launched by the Biden coup in 2014. So many people in Ukraine have died. In fact, so many millions of people around the world have died for the advancement of the World Trade System. But Ukraine, that's why there's been so much weird Biden in Ukraine shit going on. The phone call that Trump was impeached for, Trump wanted Ukraine to dig up dirt on Biden. The story that was wiped from the internet right before this past election, Hunter Biden and Ukraine. Biden, Ukraine, Biden, Ukraine. It felt so random to so many Americans because the whole Biden helped pull off a coup there part of the story was never explained to the American public by corporate media, but it did happen. And now, Commander-in-Chief Biden has congressional authorization and funding to start a regime change operation in Ukraine's neighbor to the north, Belarus. And it turns out that the building blocks of this regime change, it turns out the foundation was laid a long time ago. On Christmas Day, 1991, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, the United States recognized Belarus as an independent country. 3 years later, in 1994, President Alexander Lukashenko was elected to be the first president of Belarus, and he's been president of Belarus ever since. And so basically, it's pretty safe to assume that Belarus has never really had a democracy. But anyway, fast forward about a decade, and in 2004, there was an election that the George W. Bush administration said was fraudulent in Belarus. In response, the fully Republican-controlled 108th Congress here in the United States wrote and George W. Bush signed the Belarus Democracy Act of 2004, which is the first bill that I know of that officially authorized our interference in Belarus's government. That law allowed us to fund random groups to create political parties in Belarus and to create and distribute World Trade System propaganda in that country. That same year, the George W. Bush administration imposed a visa ban against President Lukashenko and a few other top Belarusian officials, which have been in effect ever since. 2 years later, George W. Bush signed an executive order, which is still being used today, most recently by the Trump administration, to sanction 8 Belarusian officials, which freezes their assets and restricts their travel. The following year, in 2007, the George W. Bush administration then froze the U.S. assets of a Belarusian government-owned fossil fuel firm and prohibited United States persons, otherwise known as corporations, from doing business with Belarus's fossil fuel company. Now, that company accounted for 35% of Belarus's exports and over 30% of the country's industrial output. So this was an economic war declaration against Belarus's economy. And the W. Bush administration, just 6 months later, expanded that to include even more firms that company had partial ownership of. Belarus responded by withdrawing its ambassador from Washington, D.C., and forced the United States to remove our ambassador from Belarus. And for 12 years, we didn't have an ambassador leading our relationship with Belarus until Julie Fisher was confirmed just this past December, just 3 months ago, to be our first ambassador to Belarus since 2008. And so the George W. Bush administration, like they did with so many countries on this earth, made our relationship with Belarus's government more confrontational and took us on a path towards at least economic war. And so, with the end of the W. Bush administration, how did Obama and Biden do? Well, at the beginning of the Obama years, there was some World Trade System hope when Belarus took $3.5 billion in loans from the International Monetary Fund and even more money from the World Bank, which are, again, two of the key World Trade System institutions. And in return, some sanctions were removed from Belarusian officials. But at the end of 2010, there was another presidential election in Belarus, and President Lukashenko won with almost 80% of the vote. Monitors from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is a United Nations thing, said that that election was unfair because of positive media coverage that Lukashenko had gotten from government-owned media stations and because of some kind of problems with the vote counting. There were protests, mass arrests. It was an ugly scene. And a month later, the United States and the European Union put visa and financial sanctions on the heads of Belarus's government and their families, prohibiting them from traveling and freezing their assets. They also sanctioned subsidiaries of that same government-owned fossil fuel company that we had sanctioned in 2008, along with other businesses. And so, Obama basically expanded the economic war to include the families of the Belarusian officials and put the sanctions on that super important Belarus government-owned fossil fuel company back in place. And in response, Belarus decided to just keep its stock of highly enriched uranium, which are nuclear weapons ingredients, which it had promised the Obama administration that it would get rid of. Later that year, President Lukashenko forced foreign media outlets and political non-governmental organizations in Belarus to leave, and the World Trade System's loan shark, the IMF, refused to loan Belarus any more money because Belarus had refused to enact those pesky IMF reforms, which privatize government-owned assets and tend to make lots of citizens of the country go broke. And this seems to be the moment, around 2011, when the World Trade System breakup with Belarus went Facebook official, and Belarus really turned economically towards Russia. Because by 2010, Belarus had sold off half of its natural gas firm, which controls the pipelines and other infrastructure on Belarusian territory, to Russia's government-owned gas company. And then in June 2011, Russia granted Belarus a $3 billion loan, almost exactly what the IMF had refused to give Belarus. But what's fascinating is that there were reform strings attached to the Russian money, too. Release of the Russian loan money was also conditioned on the privatization of Belarusian companies. But instead of the companies being sold to stock market beholden multinational corporations in the World Trade System, the companies would instead be sold to Russia. So, for example, in November 2011, Belarus agreed to sell its remaining portion of its main gas company to Gazprom, giving that Russian government-owned company full ownership of a large percentage of Belarus's natural gas and gas transportation network. A few months later, in the beginning of 2012, the divided 112th Congress here in the United States, so there was a Democratic Senate and a Republican House, well, the 112th Congress wrote and Obama signed H.R. 515, the Belarus Democracy and Human Rights Act. This law made it our policy to, quote, support the growth of democratic movements, unquote, and to call for new elections in Belarus. It also made it our policy to, quote, promote the conditions necessary for the integration of Belarus into the European family of democracies, unquote. It then expanded the permissions for interfering in Belarus's government that were first passed into law by the Republicans in 2004. Specifically, it expanded the permissions for propaganda efforts in Belarus conducted by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, The Voice of America, and other local outlets funded by the State Department. And it expanded permissions for our sanctions to include, quote, any, unquote, of Belarus's law enforcement officials. Later that year in 2012, Belarus held their parliamentary elections, their version of Congress elections, and President Lukashenko's partners won all 110 seats in the Belarusian parliament. Now, this was after the two opposition parties boycotted the election, and then the rest of the people that were running withdrew the day before that election. And we've seen the same thing happen in Venezuela. In fact, this whole thing reminds me of Venezuela in so many ways. But in Venezuela, we saw the opposition refuse to participate in the election, and then they called the resulting landslide win a total fraud. So this sounds kind of familiar, but even with boycotts, a 100% win rate, that's a suspicious number. And that situation only got a little bit better in 2016 when the opposition candidates were allowed to win 2 of the 110 seats in the lower house of Belarus's Congress. But then the President Lukashenko partners won all 110 seats again in 2019. And so while I'm focused on the actions of my own country, the only country I have any power in any way to control, I am pretty sure that this President Lukashenko guy is a dick. Maybe a tater. But I don't really care. That's for the citizens of Belarus to figure out and deal with. But I do have to say that their elections certainly don't look good. But the only reason the elites in control of our government here in these United States care about any of this, think back to Russia. That democracy went straight to shit in the early 1990s, but that didn't matter to us as long as the World Trade System integration reforms were happening. And so the reason that we care about Belarus is that Belarus, instead of making steps towards integration with the World Trade System, has been making steps towards Russia. And the economic integration between Russia and Belarus is quite advanced. In 2019, a full half of Belarus's trade was with Russia. The European Union as a whole was Belarus's second largest trading partner, making up only about 20% of its trade. Belarus is also a member of the Russia-led Eurasian Economic Union and relies heavily on their Russian-subsidized fossil fuel loans. Belarus is also a member of the Russian-dominated Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is a military union that Russia hopes to make into a real competitor to NATO, although the Russia one only has 6 countries in it compared to NATO's 30, so they've got a long way to go. But in terms of that military partnership, Belarus does share an air defense system with Russia. And so that's why Belarus seems to be on the target list. And both parties have had Belarus in their sights for a long time now. But last summer, while we were here dealing with COVID and Trump and ignoring everything else in the world, there was a significant development in Belarus. On August 9th, 2020, there was another presidential election in Belarus. And in it, a very pretty 37-year-old named Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya ran and lost to President Lukashenko in the Belarusian presidential election, another election that has been branded by the World Trade System countries as fraudulent and illegitimate. Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, and I'm just going to call her Svetlana from here on out. When you hear Svetlana, just know I'm talking about this opposition lady that lost to the actual president of Belarus, Lukashenko. But that last name, Svetlana entered the race after her husband, a popular anti-government video blogger, he couldn't be a candidate himself after getting locked up by President Lukashenko's government. And so after her election loss, Svetlana, who has no official role in the Belarusian government, none, fled to Lithuania and helped form a new organization called the Coordination Council for the Transfer of Power, which calls itself, quote, the unified representative body of the Belarusian people, unquote. So like it's some kind of shadow Congress for Belarus operated in another country. And its website says that it, quote, aims to facilitate the transfer of power, unquote. So pretty clear, this is a regime-changing organization. And yes, I did find it strange that the website was written in English. I was very surprised that I could read their mission statement. You would think that it would be in their local language, but nope, it was probably written more for people like me, as in World Trade System people. Anyway, in response to all of this, the Trump administration in October of 2020, the first week of October, along with the UK, Canada, and the EU, sanctioned 8 more Belarusian officials on top of the 16 who were already sanctioned after the 2006 and 2010 possibly fraudulent elections. And the Trump administration blocked them from accessing their money or property held by U.S. corporations. And that very same week, the House Committee on Foreign Affairs wrote H.R. 8438, the Belarus Democracy, Human Rights, and Sovereignty Act of 2020. H.R. 8438 is the bill that was dingleberried into law, buried in the middle of the 5,593-page coronabus. It was introduced to the Congress on September 29th, 2020, and had its markup hearing in the House Committee on Foreign Affairs just 2 days later on October 1st. Now, a markup hearing is where the committee that writes the bill edits it and votes it out to the main House of Representatives. And 2 days in between introduction and markup is very fast. Now, markup hearings are usually quite long and are almost never aired on C-SPAN. This one certainly wasn't. This markup was 4 hours long, and the Belarus bill was one of 28 bills that passed through the committee during that hearing. It had only 252 views on YouTube when I watched it. 252 views after more than 5 months on the internet. No one watches these things. And an hour and 20 minutes into that hearing, the author of the Belarus bill, Representative Chris Smith, who's a Republican from New Jersey, introduced his bill like this.
We are now approaching almost 2 months since the fraudulent poll, and the people of Belarus, despite the brutal crackdown, are still organizing rallies of 100,000 people or more, demanding that Lukashenko leave power and leave Belarus to the people to whom it belongs. I would note to my colleagues that according to the UN Special Rapporteur, more than 10,000 peaceful protesters have been detained as of September 18th, and they need our help. Recent reports indicate that the police are using now, today, increasingly violent tactics against these peaceful demonstrators. We do have a window of opportunity, and we need to seize it with everything that we have. As my colleagues know, the leading opposition presidential candidate, Svetlana Anastasia, who won the election by most accounts. Of course, there's not access to the ballots, but it seems clear that she won the election, formed the Coordination Council. Svetlana is an incredibly brave woman. She ran a brilliant campaign, but today she is in exile in Lithuania, where she continues to rally the Belarusian people and the world. I want to thank Mr. Keating for putting together that WebEx a few weeks ago with her and some of the coordination leaders from the council. We all saw anew and afresh just how important it is that we stand behind her and behind all of the people of Belarus who have aspirations for free and fair elections and for a democracy.
Svetlana Tsionskaya, or however the f*** you say that last name. But Svetlana, the Juan Guaido of Belarus, had a meeting with members of our Congress. And we do have an idea of what she probably said to them because she's been having meetings with all kinds of World Trade System people lately. So here she is speaking to a December 7th online meeting of the Atlantic Council, which is an organization whose members are called to Congress to testify all the time. But this is an organization that was created shortly after World War II, when the World Trade System was created, and it's dedicated towards, quoting from their website, quote, organizing a strong international system, unquote. And so here's Svetlana herself speaking to these titans of the World Trade System on December 7th, which was 2 weeks after H.R. 8438 passed without a vote through the House of Representatives and sat waiting for a vote it would never get in the Senate.
We are asking the West to act faster. In my opinion, Western countries should demand new and fair elections and release of all political prisoners. Belarus Democracy Act would serve as timely and extremely helpful step from the side of the U.S. government in support of the brave people of Belarus.
And here's a summary from the author of the bill that she requested of exactly what is in it.
This bill today updates the Belarus Democracy Acts of 2004, 2006, and 2011 that I authored, and renews the personal, economic, and visa sanctions on an expanded list of bad actors in the Belarusian government, and, this is new, Russian individuals complicit in the crackdown. It calls for new elections. It recognizes the Coordination Council as a legitimate institution to participate in a dialogue on a peaceful transition of power.
So let's start with the new part, an expansion of our economic war on Belarus, which so far has blocked the assets of Belarusian officials, their families, and some Belarusian companies, to now include Russians, possibly a lot of Russians. Because the new law allows economic war to be waged against, quote, Russian individuals complicit in the crackdown, unquote, and complicit isn't defined, and so complicit will basically mean what the State Department says it does. And the sanctions can include anyone who is, quote, an official in the so-called union state between Russia and Belarus, unquote, and their families. Now, the union state is a union between the two countries that they signed over 20 years ago. The idea was for it to be kind of like the European Union, but a competitor to it, with a joint tax system and common currency, shared governmental institutions, all of that. The union state for Russia and Belarus has been a thing in progress since the end of 1999, and that's a long time. And as I talked about earlier, there's been a lot of steps taken towards integration of the two countries, especially economically and militarily, which means that there's 20 years worth of officials involved in forming that union state in Belarus and Russia who could now be eligible targets, along with their families, for economic war attacks called sanctions. On top of that, the law also allows sanctions to be applied to, quote, Russian propagandists sent to replace local employees at Belarusian state media outlets. And propagandists is a term that often means journalists. It just depends on what side you're on. And so, I'm sure that the journalists at Radio Free Europe and Voice of America are called propagandists over there. And so what this means in reality is that the Russian journalists working for Belarusian government-owned media companies are now eligible targets for our sanctions too. So much for us standing for freedom of the press around the world. And that's a big escalation of our economic war, especially if Biden decides to use these new powers. And the goal of the sanctions expansion was verbalized quite clearly at the Atlantic Council by the speaker, Dr. Anders Aslund, who is a senior fellow at the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council and is also the chairman of a thing called the Scientific Council of the Bank of Finland Institute for Economies in Transition. And here's what he said in a late January meeting of the Atlantic Council titled Biden and Belarus, a Strategy for the New Administration.
The aim of the sanctions is to put sufficient pressure on Belarus so that Lukashenko has to go. This is really a regime change group of sanctions.
And regime change is all over this law. It's clearly articulated in the section that outlines our new policy, which says that we will, quote, continue rejecting the invalid results of the fraudulent August 9th, 2020 presidential election in Belarus, unquote. It also says that we will, quote, refuse to recognize Alexander Lukashenko as the legitimately elected leader of Belarus, unquote. And it is now our policy to, quote, continue supporting calls for new presidential and parliamentary elections, unquote. And you don't have to be a long-term listener to Congressional Dish to have that new policy make sense, because in preparation for the war funding work I'm doing right now, I produced an episode that I released a few days before Christmas titled Targets of the Free Marketeers. This was just 4 main episodes ago. But for that episode, I watched some 2020 foreign policy hearings to get a feel for what I should be looking out for. That episode is how Belarus even ended up on my radar. And in that segment, I played you this clip from a September 10th hearing from the same committee that wrote the Belarus bill that got dingleberried into law. So here's witness Joanna Rohozinka? I don't know. Joanna, who until the beginning of COVID was a senior program officer for Europe at the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a part of the State Department literally created to do the regime change operations that the CIA got in trouble for doing in the 1970s, which funnels our tax money to lots of organizations, including the International Republican Institute, which is a non-governmental organization that the Republican Party pretends to be unaffiliated with, but is governed by highly ranking Republicans. Like, the chairman is current Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska. Senator Tom Cotton, Senator Joni Ernst, Senator Lindsey Graham, Senator Mitt Romney, and Senator Marco Rubio are also on the board of the International Republican Institute. So unaffiliated my ass. And this Joanna lady, the woman you're about to hear, was the resident program director for Europe at the International Republican Institute during this September hearing that wasn't aired on C-SPAN and still has less than 1,000 views on YouTube.
I would certainly invest in looking at calling early parliamentary elections as being much more significant, because once you turn the House, once you turn the Parliament, then at least you start building up a degree of political capital that can start carrying forward into the governance.
Now notice the focus on calling for new parliamentary, their version of congressional elections. That's important because there are signs that they are going to use the Venezuela method for this regime change at the presidential level, where in Venezuela, they've said since 2017 that Venezuelan President Maduro rigged his election, and therefore another dude named Juan Guaido is the real president, even though he definitely is not. And if that is a confusing statement, there are episodes about the Venezuela regime change attempt by the Trump administration waiting for you in this episode's show notes. And I should take a quick second here and emphasize the show notes because this might be your first Congressional Dish episode. I want you to know that I don't expect you to take my word for any of this. Trust is earned, and if you don't know me, I can't go telling you that we're kind of secretly in the process of overthrowing another government and expect you to just trust that. And so that's why I spend a lot of time creating show notes for each episode with every book, document, article, and source for sound clips that I play for you. For the Corona Bus, I don't just link to the 5,593-page bill and expect you to find this stuff for yourself. I outlined the relevant part of the law in plain language and linked to the specific provisions that will take you right to the page in the law where it says what I say it says. And for sound clips from these super long hearings, I give you timestamps with transcripts so you can easily find the clip and hear it in context so that you can judge for yourself if my editing is fair. I think that trust is earned, and this is how I think I can best earn it. And so don't just trust me on any of this. Use those show notes, which you can find on congressionaldish.com and in a lot of podcast apps in the notes sections. And in this episode show notes, I've got a list of old Congressional Dish episodes that will give you more information about the stuff that I've researched in the past and have just kind of mentioned today. So I've done a lot of episodes on Ukraine and at least 2 about Venezuela. And, this episode and the analysis in it, this is building on years of research that I've done. And so check those out if I'm glossing over some backstory that you feel out of the know, because the people that have been listening to this podcast for a long time, I think they're getting pretty tired of hearing the Ukraine story over and over again. But I know that a lot of this stuff is just not common knowledge, which again is why I do this show. But anyway, you should listen to the Venezuela ones in the show notes in particular, because spoiler alert, I do know for a fact that the Biden administration intends to continue that regime change that was started by the Trump administration. And I'll have information about that for you in the next episode. But anyway, back to Belarus. Check this out. This appears to be a pretty good summary of the propaganda story that the world traders are going to run with for the Belarus situation. So this is from December 7th at the Atlantic Council with Svetlana, the lady who wants to be the president of Belarus. And the person you're going to hear speaking is Damon Wilson, who is the executive vice president of the Atlantic Council, who was also in the W. Bush administration and worked on the regime change in Iraq.
After her husband was jailed by Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko while running for president, Svetlana stepped in. Running a historic campaign for change, much of the world recognizes that she overwhelmingly won the August 9th election. But Tsikhanouskaya was forced to flee the country after the regime threatened her family. The people of Belarus have protested for months, demanding that Lukashenko resign. They are the true source of legitimacy. Tsikhanouskaya and the Coordination Council for the Transition of Power, which she leads from Vilnius, Lithuania, is recognized by the European Union and many others as the true voice of the Belarusian people.
And to that end, the Corona Bus makes it official U.S. policy to, quote, recognize the Coordination Council as a legitimate institution to participate in a dialogue on a peaceful transition of power, unquote. And so it appears that the world traders are going to say that this chick is the real winner of the election, that she's the legitimate president of Belarus, and that this organization she created is the real voice of the Belarusian people, despite the fact that neither Svetlana nor her organization are a part of the Belarusian government at all. They're both in Lithuania, for Christ's sake. But the play that appears to be taking shape is to pretend that Lukashenko isn't really the president anymore, and that someone else, right now that's Svetlana, should be in charge instead, and just hope that it sticks. And if they can get a new parliament elected inside of Belarus that will support that switcheroo, that's how they might be able to get it to stick inside of the Belarusian government. But to make that story stick, they have to influence the result of future parliamentary elections. And so here's what Jamie Fly told Congress to do to help that happen in that off C-SPAN watched by damn near no one hearing back in September. Jamie Fly is a former member of the George W. Bush administration's Defense Department and National Security Council, who went on to be the president and CEO of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, which are two of our State Department-funded propaganda channels, and he was the head of those organizations in 2019 and 2020. Right now, notably, he's a senior advisor to West Exec Advisors, which is a company that helps corporations make money using their insider knowledge. And this company was co-founded by our new Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. So basically, Jamie Fly, the guy you're about to hear, is a U.S. propaganda leader who definitely has the ear of his former boss, the Secretary of State, one of the most powerful people in the world. And here's what he told the committee that wrote the Belarus Dingleberry 2 weeks before they finished writing it.
We have tools. The Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty has a Belarusian language service, Radio Svoboda, which has significant followers inside Belarus. The problem is that Lukashenko, like many other authoritarians, have realized that when they face significant pressure, they should take the country offline. And the Belarusian authorities have done that on a regular basis, which makes it much more difficult to communicate and allow information to spread freely. So what they really need, outlets like Svoboda and other independent media, are access to internet circumvention tools, which are also funded by the State Department and the U.S. Agency for Global Media.
And so taking that advice, the House Foreign Affairs Committee's Dingleberry Law orders the Biden administration to submit a strategy with a cost estimate, which is allowed to be partially classified, for expanding radio, television, live stream, and social network communications inside of Belarus. Part of the Biden strategy is required to include a plan to, quote, develop and deploy circumvention technologies to allow people in Belarus to communicate on the internet without interference from the government of Belarus, unquote. And I can't possibly know what that specifically means. All I know for sure is that the olds in charge of the world ignored this goofy thing called the internet, where we were all sharing cat videos and just being stupid. They ignored the internet for a really long time, like too long. But ever since the internet was used to share information about and defeat the World Trade System's goddess, Hillary Clinton, in 2016, the U.S. government is making a real play to globally control this internet problem and the free flow of information that is proving to be problematic for them. And so, while I can't even guess what technology they're talking about specifically, whether it's like a side internet they're building or if they're planning to somehow control what the Belarusian officials can and can't see, I have no idea. But this is an example of our government looking to control internet access overseas. And what that looks like in reality remains to be seen. And we're all aware of the social media censorship that's going on here at home that's being requested by government officials and carried out by private tech companies. Like, we are all aware that Trump's accounts have been wiped from the internet. But when it comes to Belarus, the Biden strategy also has to do a cost estimate to, quote, build the capacity of civil society, media, and other non-governmental organizations to identify, track, and counter disinformation, unquote. Translation, the Biden administration is creating a strategy to fund whatever organizations they want to identify, track, and counter information. And an interesting, very likely connected side note here. Our producer, Ryan, on Patreon, was looking for a job recently and was like perusing the job openings. And he found a job opening for a Belarusian social media analyst who would be based out of Tampa, Florida. The job posting is in the defense category, and it requires secret security clearance. And it says that the social media analyst would be hired to, quote, support a large federal agency, unquote. The job entails identifying, quote, key communicators, unquote, and being able to read and create communications, quote, regarding regional and ideological discussions, unquote, in the Belarusian language. And so they're hiring for the propaganda team, security clearance required. So fascinating. Excellent find, Ryan. Thank you for sharing that with me. But yeah, the Biden administration right now is crafting this broad strategy ordered by Congress to pump up the propaganda in Belarus and combat the information they don't want out there. And again, they can classify, which means hide, as much of this strategy report as they like. But whatever the details are that end up in that strategy report and whatever we're allowed to see, that has to be submitted to Congress by the end of April. Now, once the strategy report is done, if it isn't already, the Biden administration will have plenty of tools available to get moving because the Coronabus Dingleberry authorizes, quote, Belarusian groups outside of Belarus to receive our assistance. And here's an idea being kicked around that would use that exact authority. This is from January 27th, just 6 weeks ago, in the Atlantic Council during that meeting about Biden and Belarus, a strategy for the new administration. The person you're going to hear from is Melinda Herring. She is the deputy director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. She's currently on the Council on Foreign Relations, and she has worked for the National Democratic Institute, which is the sister organization to the International Republican Institute that is also officially unaffiliated with the Democratic Party and yet is full of Democratic Party heavyweights. Like Madeleine Albright is the chairman of their board. So she's all up in this regime-changey State Department shit. And here's Melinda Herring's idea about how the authorization to assist Belarusians outside Belarus could be used in practice.
I think that Ukraine could definitely play a role here. And, there's a lot of Belarusians who are in Ukraine. One of the more interesting things I found in my section of the report, I focused on the domestic picture, is where Belarusians have gone since August. So Belarusians have gone to Kiev, they've gone to Riga, they've gone to Vilnius, and they've gone to Warsaw. And they're creating massive civil society organizations that are helping people who had to leave quickly. And many of the people in Kiev are students. So you can help students. You can, you can send them pizza. You can provide a house for them. You can do very basic things.
So the World Trade System moles in our government are being told to funnel our tax money to regime change pizza parties in Ukraine. Now, this is not exactly what this American taxpayer is expecting my money to pay for when I write my big fat check to the federal government every April. We don't pay for pizza or housing or tuition or books for our own college students here. And so I'm fairly certain, being an American and all, that Ukrainian pizza parties for regime change wouldn't go over well if that were a clear line item in the funding law. And so how do they fund stuff like this?
The problem, though, is that there's all kinds of limitations on moving money into Belarus. A, it's a security state. B, we have COVID, and people can't move in and out of the country very easily. So this has to be handled sensitively. The folks that I'm talking to say that cryptocurrencies are the way to do it, but there's a bigger problem. The U.S. government is not very good at moving money. They are tied up in all kinds of reporting requirements. The European Union has the same issues, but we need to think more creatively. We need to be more creative. If we don't think with some new creative energy, this protest movement is going to fizzle out. So it's time to go back to the drawing boards and talk to people who are good at moving money and make it happen now.
We think of cryptocurrencies, or at least I do, as a way for my shady friends to buy drugs. And the only time I've ever used Bitcoin was to pay a ransom. Cryptocurrencies, when they're demonized, are often branded as shadow currencies that let us dangerous peasants get around the law. And when they're praised by us peasants, they're often framed as a way for us to get around having our financial transactions tracked. But I guess it never occurred to me that they're being used by governments too, and it makes so much sense. Especially this year, the big money, hedge funds, banks, corporate treasurers, pension funds, they've all gotten into Bitcoin this year. That's why the price is now over 50 grand per Bitcoin. So of course the regime changers would want to use it too. I actually feel quite stupid for not considering that sooner. But whether it's cryptocurrencies or fiat bullshit money, there is money to be used because the dingleberry in the Coronabus says that U.S. foreign assistance should be increased. And while it doesn't say who will be doing all the assisting, it does order the State Department's Office of the Coordinator of U.S. Assistance to Europe and Eurasia and the Administrator of USAID to submit a report by Christmas that tells Congress what programs and activities they funded and how well they're working. So I think those are the offices to watch. But the kicker for me, the thing that made me decide that this episode had to be produced right now, is the authorization of funding. Because the Dingleberry Law authorizes, quote, such sums as may be necessary, unquote, for fiscal years 2021 and 2022. Put another way, that's unlimited funding. Now, I want to be clear here that this is an authorization. It's permission for unlimited funding. There are limits in terms of how much the State Department is given in their money buckets for foreign assistance and how much they choose to devote to this. But the State Department money buckets for assistance are huge. They get measured in the billions. Like the Economic Support Fund alone got filled up with over $3 billion more in 2021. But they also have a whole bunch of other funds. So they have the Countering Russian Influence Fund, and they have a money bucket for assistance for Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia. There are democracy funds at both the State Department and USAID, and there's all kinds of permissions to move money around. Money from old laws, money from this law, from one fund to another. They have a lot of permission to shift things. And so the short answer to how much money is going to be spent on this, I have no idea, and I have no way to find out. All I know for sure is that the World Trade System insider conversations are very clear about their overall goal. Here's Dirk Schubel. He is the ambassador of the European Union to Belarus. Here he is speaking to the Atlantic Council on November 6th.
The pro-democracy movement in Belarus now faces the difficult prospect of dislodging Mr. Lukashenko, the unrecognized president who refuses to leave office.
And his replacement has already been chosen. In a meeting with her at the Atlantic Council on December 7th, she was asked this by Melinda Herring.
How can the people of Belarus change the dynamic on the ground and force out Lukashenko?
Lukashenko out. That's the goal, and it is clear. And there's a lady waiting to take his place, Svetlana. And we know that she had meetings with our members of Congress in the House Foreign Affairs Committee about this Belarus bill, which is now law. She then communicated with all of us while the Corona bus was being written in early December. Here's Melinda Herring talking to Svetlana herself on December 7th.
I wanted to tell our audience, if they haven't had a chance to get a copy of the Washington Post, Ms. Tikhanovskaya has a piece in it this weekend. It's called "The People of Belarus Are Still Marching, Help Us." And she writes very passionately about the need to pass the Belarus Democracy, Human Rights, and Sovereignty Act of 2020. There's 2 weeks left to pass this act before Congress is out. Ms. Tikhanovskaya, what's in it and why is it important?
We appreciate the bipartisan support received in favor of this act. We hope that this draft bill becomes law as soon as possible, as it would inspire the U.S. to act decisively and urgently to support Belarus. Belarusian peaceful protest is a turning point. People struggle, people suffer. People struggle, every day with great dedication. Yet there is a need of support on behalf of the international community. And when the new Democracy Act becomes law, it would send a strong signal to the Belarusian regime and the rest of the world on non-recognition of Lukashenko's legitimacy, call for new presidential elections under OSCE standards, and demand the release of all political prisoners. In our opinion, the act would allow prompt U.S. assistance to the civil society, media, and urgent actions such as countering internet blockages in Belarus.
So the wannabe president, Svetlana of Belarus, wrote an article in the Washington Post saying basically that. But she said this in our nation's capital's newspaper. And in addition to meeting with members of Congress who wrote the bill that she wanted, she also mentions in that article that she met with Stephen Biegun, who was Trump's deputy secretary of state at the time. But knowing by that time that she wrote the article that Biden was incoming, she said in the article, quote, "I look forward to developing a strong relationship with the new administration in order to facilitate democratic transition in Belarus," unquote. She said, quote, "We need more help from the United States, even in this complex transitional period. I appeal to the U.S. Congress to swiftly pass the Belarus Democracy, Human Rights, and Sovereignty Act of 2020, unquote." And she said, quote, "I hope the House and Senate can reach agreement before the end of the year. Time is of the essence," unquote. And they did. They dingleberried her request into law, even though the Senate never got a chance to vote on it. And now that the Biden administration has the authorizations that they need to move money around to fund this operation, unlimited money, the last thing we need to know is Biden on board? As we learned during the Trump years, Congress can give permissions for all kinds of stuff, but that doesn't mean that the occupant of the White House will actually use them. And so, is President Biden on board? Well, if his campaign website is to be believed, yes. On October 27th, the Biden campaign issued a statement that said, quote, The international community should significantly expand its sanctions on Lukashenko's henchmen and freeze the offshore accounts where they keep their stolen wealth. As president, I will also work with our European partners and allies to lay out a plan of economic support for a truly sovereign, democratic Belarus. Until then, I will continue to join Svetlana, what is her name, and the people of Belarus in calling for the peaceful transfer of power, unquote. And that's a pretty clear yes to me. He's clearly aiming for a transfer of power in Belarus. But let's not lose sight of the big picture here, because this is bigger than Belarus. This is Russia-sized, which the Atlantic Council people are saying is going to make this particular regime change challenging. So here's Professor Vladislav, oh man, I know Zemstev, these names. But okay, here's a professor, and he's a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is, a world trade system pushing think tanky thing. And here he is speaking to the Atlantic Council on November 6th.
Even if the government in Belarus changes, Russia will not, it cannot decouple from Belarus because there are a lot of links which tightens two countries. First of all, Belarus is a part of the so-called Union State with Russia, existing from 1999. It's a part of the Eurasian Economic Union. And in this case, Russia cannot allow itself to lose Belarus. It's a huge difference between Belarus and Ukraine, for example, in this case, because Ukraine never was a part of any Russian-led integrationist organizations, but Belarus is.
And beyond being in Russia's organizations, Belarus is just all kinds of economically tied up with Russia. So here's Dr. Anders Aslund of the Atlantic Council speaking only about 6 weeks ago during the Atlantic Council meeting about the Biden administration's Belarus strategy.
Lukashenko today has only reserves for about 1 month of imports. Normally it said it should be for 3 months. And he has $3 billion of cash. He needs $6 billion more to carry this cover this year. And traditionally, there are two sources to get that. One is from the IMF, and that is not available because the IMF is not prepared to deal with Lukashenko because he is normally cheating them, and they know that. And the other source is Russia. Putin declared when Lukashenko came to his knees to Putin in Sochi on the 14th of September that he's ready to give $1.5 billion as loans. Mm-hmm. But Lukashenko needs much more. And what Putin hinted at, it is that Russian private money can come in and buy the big companies. And the Belarusian economy is quite concentrated to a few big companies. So there are 4 big companies, 2 fertilizer plants and 2 oil refineries that account for 2/3 of Belarus's exports to the West. And then where do they get the raw materials from? The oil comes from Russia, and the gas for one of the fertilizer plants come from Russia. So the natural thing is that Russian private businessmen buy these Belarusian companies. We have seen it before. It has happened with gas assets in Belarus, and half of one of the refineries is already bought by Russian companies. But where does the money come from? It comes from Russian state banks. So what Putin is essentially saying, it is a couple of my most loyal oligarchs are allowed to get billions of dollars of Russian state bank financing in order to buy Belarusian companies cheaply. And that would completely tie up the Belarusian economy. And this is what we have to avoid.
And so what do they want to happen instead?
More money must come. And as we have discussed, all of us, this essentially has to come from the private sector. Ideally, this would be an IMF program, but the IMF is not ready to go for any program with Lukashenko. they haven't had anything since 2009 because Lukashenko refuses to do the elementary things, stop subsidies to state enterprises and deregulate certain prices. So this is out of question.
So Lukashenko has to go. And someone has to be installed who will please the IMF, who will please the World Trade System's loan shark, and take their money instead of Russia's. And here's an outline of the game plan being kicked around for how to do this. So this is John Erbst. He's the director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. He was the W. Bush administration's U.S. ambassador to Uzbekistan, and he's been our U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. This was on January 27th, so just 6 weeks ago. This was that meeting about Biden and Belarus. And in this clip, he's going to mention funding for RFE and RL. Those are Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, which are U.S. State Department funded information or propaganda outlets, depending on who you ask.
The first is to promote the legitimacy of the opposition in Ms. Tsikhanouskaya and the delegitimization of Lukashenko. So, for example, our ambassador, when she goes out, Julie Fisher, a wonderful diplomat, should not present her credentials to Lukashenko. She should be spending most of her time in Vilnius near Ms. Tsikhanouskaya. Two, we should organize the U.S. government to manage this crisis. So we should have a senior coordinator to manage sanctions against the Lukashenko regime and maybe against appropriate Russians. And also we should have a senior official designated to manage assistance to the opposition and to the people of Belarus. And finally, this combines both organization and resources. We should double the budget of RFE and RL so we can get out our message to the people of Belarus. The third category is to increase specific support to the opposition. So, for example, Melinda already mentioned the need to get resources to the opposition using cryptocurrency. We should also push for the legitimacy of the opposition. The next element is to keep Russia out of the conflict. I mean, they're already in. We've seen what they've done by sending media experts, for example. But this involves, I'd say, a series of measures that have to be conducted simultaneously. One, we don't want to frighten the Russians into thinking that Belarus is now going to become part of the West. So we would encourage the opposition not to talk about NATO, not to talk about the EU, to talk simply about the need for Belarus to choose its own president. Two, with the EU, we should be in dialogue with Moscow about the crisis in Belarus. But three, we should send a very clear signal to Moscow that if they intervene with their repressive apparatus, whether with their secret police, with their regular police, with their military, to repress the people of Belarus, or to prop up Lukashenko, or a Lukashenko-like alternative, there will be serious sanctions against the Russian economy, against Russian officials.
So this regime change is in motion. And we've definitely moved beyond interference and are deep into the economic warfare stage, having waged it for 16 years and counting against more and more people in Belarus, and now that's been expanded so that Russians can be targeted too. And of course, there's an unlimited funding authorization for the State Department for 2 years to fund any organization that they want inside and outside of Belarus. And Svetlana's Coordination Council, specifically mentioned in the new law, is in Lithuania and definitely qualifies. And so, clearly, regime change on. But if you're someone who is not in favor of having your tax money used to violently overthrow other governments, you might be pleased to know that Belarus isn't mentioned at all in the defense authorization, the military one. This regime change is firmly in the economic war stage, so it's the State Department's domain, not the military's domain, as of right now. But we do have troops standing by in Belarus's neighbor countries to the north. Long-term Congressional Dish listeners will remember this, but starting in 2014, the same year that Joe Biden regime changed Ukraine, Belarus's neighbor to the south, well, that politically divided Congress authorized and Obama-Biden started the European Reassurance Initiative, which is a military backup in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And back then, it was the Reassurance Initiative. Reassurance as in, we're just here to let Europe know that we've got their back. It's chill. Just here to reassure. And it was funded with under $1 billion by Congress in its first year. But by the time Obama and Biden left office, the name got changed to what it is today, the European Deterrence Initiative. As in Russia, we're here to deter you, back the fuck off. And that's only barely a paraphrase. In the 2021 budget request written by the Defense Department, they said that the European Deterrence Initiative is designed to, quote, deter Russian aggression in the East, unquote. And the funding kept increasing from under $1 billion during its first year to $6.5 billion in 2019. And so, looking at the authorization for this year, in 2021, the European Deterrence Initiative funding is going to pay for 9,904 members of our military to be stationed on Russia and Belarus's doorsteps. But the Trump Defense Department requested less money for this military buildup than in prior years. So like I said, in 2019, it got over $6.5 billion. In 2020, it got a little less. It got about $6 billion. But for 2021, the Trump administration requested only $4.5 billion, with over $300 million of that allowed to be classified. But the way this program is funded, it's not like there's one line that says European Deterrence Initiative in the funding law. I got those numbers from a report made by the Defense Department about the European Deterrence Initiative. And so instead of just having a line telling us how much funding it gets, the funding is spread all over a bunch of different sections of the government funding law. And so I can't tell you exactly what the military buildup got in reality for 2021. I don't know if the Trump budget cut happened or if Congress kept the funding high while writing the final versions of these bills after the election, knowing that Biden, not Trump, would be the next president. And until I can get my hands on a report on the European Deterrence Initiative that adds up all the different funding lines for 2021, I have no way to know what the actual funding for this year is going to be. But I'm fairly certain that $4.5 billion is the basement funding level. If it's different, it's almost certainly more. And even the lowest possible amount is 4 times its original funding level when the purpose was just to reassure our friends in Europe. And then there's the Russian side of the war equation, which has had a recent development. On March 2nd, according to Russian media, the Russian and Belarusian defense ministries signed a strategic partnership program for the next 5 years, the first that they've formed such a military partnership. And so when it comes to actual war, we're not there yet. But the foundation is under construction on both sides of the divide. And almost no one knows about it. Which is where you can help by sharing this episode with people you think would give a shit. Because one of my weaknesses as a host of this show is that I really don't do any marketing for this podcast. And I have felt so guilty about that for a really long time. And so, knowing what's the point of doing this if no one hears it and if it's not growing, I recently looked into hiring someone to do marketing for me. But I found out that marketing professionals cost a minimum of $3,500 per month. Go and look at my Patreon. I'm all about full transparency for producers. My funding is public, and I make $3,000 or so per episode right now. So $3,500 a month to advertise, the minimum, I clearly can't afford that and have enough to, pay for my life and for my sister and my editors and my virtual assistant and all the things that I pay for. And so while it's frustrating to realize that I can't outsource the marketing to professionals, it's also a realization for me that marketing is a full-time job. And I'm already the CEO, the chief executive producer, the head writer, the research staff director, the co-editor, and the host of Congressional Dish. That's a lot of jobs. I just don't have room for marketing. And I felt really guilty about that. Basically every day when I see the amazing job that Erica Mandy is doing with the Newsworthy's Instagram feed. She has built such an amazing team for an amazing podcast, and I'm so proud of her. I'm impressed with myself for being her friend. But after looking at the cost, I'm actually feeling a lot better about my not doing any marketing, because clearly doing it and well is something that a whole human usually does in a media company. And also considering how much I hate doing it, I can also appreciate the value. Because even though I'm really proud of my work, marketing my own show just feels braggy and like a dirty Hollywoodish thing to do. You might not know this about me, but I went to college and lived for many years in the suburbs of Hollywood. And I'm actually living within hiking distance of the Kardashians right now. And so I probably have an abnormally adverse reaction to self-advertising because it happens so much in Los Angeles. But I really hate doing it. And so to see that digital marketers make way more money than I do for just that one job, it does make me feel a little less guilt that I'm not trying to do that job too, which got me thinking. I've heard from a lot of you, more and more lately, who write to me to say that you love the show and you feel the need to apologize for not paying for it because you're struggling. And you know that I'm going through a firing wave, which absolutely happened because I pissed off the Republicans after members of their party stormed the Capitol and tried to keep their guy as president, doing a totally undemocratic thing. I was very mad at Republicans for that, especially the ones in Congress. But then the Democrats did a really shitty job on the impeachment. It was basically like the worst they could have possibly done. And I said that in the last episode. And so all of the tribal Democrats are now firing me too. So my income is going down. And so I'm hearing from people that are saying like, hey, just want to give you some moral support. I can't pay for you right now, but like, I love what you're doing. Keep doing it. You know, the tribal people. And I really appreciate those messages. But I think that right now, a year into COVID, that a sizable chunk of this audience is feeling cash strapped and can't pay for the show right now. And that's leading to feelings of guilt. And I never want a guilty relationship with you because guilt, in my experience, can, at least the way it's worked with me, is that guilt, I feel like, can easily lead to resentment, which on my end, I think also explains some of the anger people feel about my opinions on the show, which is then used to justify not paying me in cash because cash is precious and you don't want to feel like a freeloader. And so if you can think of a reason to be mad at me, but still listen and learn from the episodes, you know, I think some of the cycle of anger towards me is born of that financial guilt. It's born of people wanting to have a reason to not pay me, to feel justified in that. And I don't want that cycle, you know? I understand being cash strapped. You know, I've been there. And I also understand being like borderline okay financially, but wanting to save to have a cushion. And I want that for you. I want that for all of us. And I know and can definitely empathize with everyone who is getting fucked up by this COVID economy. And I hope that the American Rescue Act helps a lot of people that are feeling that way, but it's not done yet. But I've realized that digital marketing clearly has value. And so if you're someone who understands that I make my living from this show 100% on listener donations, but truly can't pay and you feel guilty about that, pay me in your digital marketing talents and efforts. That has value. You know, I know some of you are amazing at Instagram posts. Make posts with snippets of information from these episodes and link to the episode. Go on Reddit forums and talk to people and try to get them to listen to an episode about whatever you guys are talking about. You can make posts about yourself talking about the episodes. You can make ads for your favorite episodes. You can also, this is super effective, learn to create audiograms with your favorite snippets of the show. Audiograms are the ones that you'll see on Instagram where it's, you know, you'll hear 30 seconds of a podcast and then it'll be transcribed. There's programs that do that for you. It's actually really easy to make. And I wish people would create those. And the reason is the only time I've turned on a podcast because of something I've seen on Instagram or Facebook, which are the same thing, it was because of an audiogram. You know, you can make 10 of those for free per month using the Headliner app. And I would love to see people doing that and sharing the most fascinating bits of these episodes with your social network. That would not only help me market the show, but if you tag me, it would also let me know what pieces of the episodes are your favorites, which is valuable as I'm trying to figure out, you know, which topics to cover and how to do them. And so there's also real world ways of sharing the show. Like I know a guy was printing stickers of the logo and putting them in bathroom stalls in bars. It's kind of vandalism, but I love it. But the truth is that honestly, I don't have the marketing ideas. That's not my specialty. That's kind of the point. You do. You know how to get your friends to try new things. And so what I'm saying is please run with them. And I don't even have to see them. If you're doing it and you're tuning in new listeners to the show, then we're good because more listeners does equal more money for me eventually because of my value for value business model. So volunteer to market the show if you're short on cash. And to measure it, let's say that we're even if you can get one new person to try the show per episode. And that shouldn't be that hard because a powerful audiogram alone can get many more people than that. And if you make me aware somehow of your efforts, I'll totally add people to the Green Room, which is my private feed where you get extra bonus episodes and sometimes like my production notes. I'm going to have one. I have some decisions to make, so I'm going to talk to the Green Room soon about that, but it's producers only back there. But if you're a marketer, you are a producer because you're donating time. And, you know, so show me you're on the team. And yes, I will totally consider adding people who are doing a great job with marketing. Because the business model here is value for value. This show has value, and obviously money does too, but so does your time and your talent. You know, there's more than one way to return value to this show. That said, if you do have money, the show always needs it, because clearly I can't afford the kinds of services that corporate media can. And you can find links to my Patreon, PayPal, Venmo, Zelle, cryptocurrency wallets, and physical address for checks in every episode's show notes. And thank you to everyone who sends in cash. I would not be doing this without the money. Although I did do this without the money for a full year, but I don't think that I could still be doing this almost a decade later if I was still doing it for free. And I think it makes the show better. You know, you didn't hear a single ad today, and that's not because I can't get them. I can, and I turn them down all the time. But I like that our relationship is based on trust. I created a show that says things that no one else is saying, that exists for you, not to sell your time for ad money. And I trust that you'll pay whatever you think is fair for the value you receive. It's the honor system. And even though this funding model is not a path to riches for me, and my choice to not pick a political team is not a path to fame, that's for sure. But I am so proud of this community, and I hope you are too. And whether you choose to participate with your time or your money, I hope that you will participate. Because you know you're learning things on this show that you're not learning anywhere else. Who is talking about Belarus? And if this show can be successful, maybe we can inspire more people in media to stay independent, to serve listeners instead of advertisers, to serve us the truth, no matter who complains. This show and its business model, if you participate, can be a part of a bigger media change. And so with that in mind, I'd like to thank 2 executive producers of Congressional Dish who have contributed enough to have paid for a significant part of an episode's production costs and can now have their names listed as an executive producer on their favorite episode, which is a very public vouch. So first up, I want to thank Nick Secord. And Nick said, "Hi, Jen. According to my accounting, I've accumulated $832.50 on Patreon and PayPal since I started supporting in 2017. I'd like to be an executive producer of the next Congressional Dish episode because the best episode is always the next one. Keep up the great work." So congratulations, Nick. Your name is going to be on this one. And I must say, this is a good one to be an executive producer on because I don't know where else I would hear this information. This one feels really important to me. So thank you for being the executive producer. Your contributions have helped so much, and you're basically paying for all the editing. So thank you. Thank you, Nick. Very happy to have you on the team. And I would also like to thank our other executive producer, Mike Coverdale, who said, quote, "I would like a producer credit for Congressional Dish 195 Yemen. The travesty over the past years that has driven so many to starvation and death with the help of the United States is unconscionable. Although Biden has made overtures to limit Saudi human rights abuses, it seems more like lip service than actual action. It seems like the strong actions passed by Congress last year but vetoed by Trump have been watered down. I know that there are many issues for you to deal with, but revisiting Yemen's status would be great." Well, thank you for being an executive producer. You actually have credits on quite a few episodes. And when it comes to Yemen, I will be looking for all of the Yemen provisions in the National Defense Authorization Act, which I am getting back to now that I have tackled this dingleberry that I found, but I felt deserved its standalone episode so that we can understand the full backstory. But yeah, executive producers are people that have contributed $535 or more. You can be an instant executive producer by just writing us a check for $535 or sending in a Venmo, whatever works for you. Or it can be cumulative, like it was for Nick. It took him about 4 years, but he got to it and is now going to be the executive producer of Congressional Dish 229 Belarus. Target Belarus, I think is what I'm calling it. But for all other producers at every level, you are thanked and can have your feedback and opinions heard on the bonus thank you episodes, and I'll produce one of those for you by the end of the month. I skipped one because I kind of felt like doing 2 main episodes this month was really important with this whole Belarus regime change thing. And so, like I said, I'm going to get back to reading the defense authorization. The next episode will still be war related. I know that we have the American Rescue Bill law being signed, and I will read that. So yeah, still a shitload of work on my desk, but thank you so much for supporting this work because we are proving that it's important to know what is buried in the middle of these massive laws. So thank you to every producer of Congressional Dish. You are the reason this show exists. So take care, you guys. I really hope this new American Rescue thingy gets you some cash if you need it. But if you are doing okay financially, once again, please support Congressional Dish. All right. Love you guys. Talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.
On August 9th, 2020, there was another presidential election in Belarus, and a very pretty 37-year-old named Svetlana Tsihanuskaya. Named Svetlana Tsihanuskaya. All right, one more time. Tsihanuskaya. A very pretty 37-year-old named Svetlana Tsihanuskaya. Fucking Russian names. A very pretty 37-year-old named Svetlana Tsihanuskaya ran and lost. I have practiced that name too many times. I can't do this name. Svetlana Tsihanuskaya. Now I can fucking say it. A very pretty 37-year-old named Svetlana Okay. Tsihanuskaya.